So these are the things that we'll cover today. What diversity in journalism means and why it matters. We'll do a short refresher on solutions journalism. What is it? What are the basics? And then look at how we apply a solutions approach to diversity coverage in particular. And at the end, we'll have a longer discursive discussion with Luke and Sandeep. So looking forward very much to that. So first of all, so get ready because I will be expecting, I guess, just responses to some of these open questions that we'll be asking from you in the chat box if you have a moment. We'll have a look at what diversity actually means and what does it mean in the context of journalism, and then why does it matter? So when you think about diversity, what's an aspect of your own identity that might surprise your colleagues? Or might be a bit unexpected about you. For example, you might have grown up in a regional town. Perhaps one or both of your parents were born abroad. Maybe you had a different career before journalism. So if you want to just pop your notes in the chat box, and when you're using the chat box, you'll see there are a couple of options there. One of them is host and panelists, but if you just scroll and select everyone, it would be great if you do that. Sandy, what's something perhaps that's unexpected about your identity that might surprise your colleagues?
So it's actually very surprising because I grew up in the US and I've been in Australia for about 20 years. But while I grew up there, I was, raised a Hindu and didn't eat meat. And then I started eating meat. And then I fell in love with it. When I came to Australia, I missed chili con carne because I grew up in Southern California and with a lot of Mexican influences. So I started cooking it, and then I started entering it into chili cooking competitions. And then I became the Australian chili cook-off champion for about 3 years running. Definitely the first South Asian person to ever even compete, let alone win that. And so I think we can't make assumptions often about people because they can surprise you in so many different ways. And I'm definitely the only South Asian person I know who has ever competed in chili cooking competition in Australia.
Fantastic. And Luke?
Oh, a common one in various workplaces. I'm not related to Noel Pearson for a start. There you go. We're two black fellas named Pearson who aren't related in any way, shape, or form. But I was a primary teacher before sort of stumbling my way sideways into media via social media. And I grew up on a 500-acre property. So most of my life, was spent down in Wiradjuri country in a little town called The Rock. So a lot of regional sort of farming connections in my background as well.
Excellent. And something that I think perhaps I found, I lived more or less as a migrant in the UK for about 16 years. So I moved there, had dual citizenship. And when I came back to Australia, I realized that my brain had changed about where I was from, which I wasn't expecting. I think they should put a little note in your passport that says, if you spend an X amount of time in a different place, you'll always be a little bit from there, if that makes sense. Thanks, folks. And again, if you're on the call and you've got a moment to pop something in the chat box, you're very welcome to contribute some of your own thoughts as well. So if we think about this aspect of our identity, providing specific insights or perspectives that perhaps others might not have if they've had a different life experience. If you're from regional Australia or you grew up in regional Australia, you might understand some of the challenges around healthcare and public transport, for example, that one might perhaps take more for granted if you've mostly spent your life in a major urban centre, for instance. You might have lived experience of being a migrant. Perhaps your earlier career helps you do your current job better. So if you've got some thoughts around that, and Luke, if your experience working as a primary school teacher, how does that impact what you've been doing at Indigenous X, for example?
There's pretty gross underrepresentation of Indigenous teachers in the teaching profession. But I think, when I came to media via social media, I was very much a teacher without a classroom. So I do take a very strong educational lens. I don't assume that the audience already knows things. And I certainly, particularly when it comes to Indigenous reporting, I think there's a lot of benefit of the doubt that we give our audience that, racism is some fringe thing or thing of the past. which has certainly not been my experience of racism growing up and living in this country. So I take a pretty strong stance, but always make sure, I follow that principle of scaffolding, where it's like work where your students are, and then, step by step to where you want them to go.
And Sandeep, I mean, there are different things that you've mentioned in terms of your life journey. One of them was growing up as a Hindu. Another one is growing up in the United States. How does that bring you perspectives, perhaps, that I don't like to use the phrase mainstream Australians, but let's say, how one might think about being an Aussie. What does that bring to your perspectives on that?
I guess I'm a double migrant, with parents from India and also a second generation migrant as well. So I carry both in my identity. And I also have that experience of seeing the South Asian diaspora take its shape in other countries and then seeing how it's taking a shape here. And it's a different shape and it's a different timeline, especially if you could compare, say, migration in the UK versus the US. Which my parents moved in the 60s there, to Australia, where, white Australia led to later migration at a different point. So, and that's actually very much the genesis behind Sardi and how that began. And when I first came here over 20 years ago, I did a master's thesis on South Asian identity in Australia in the media, comparing those countries. And there's this framework that is often described, an acronym that's usually described for people who are like myself, and it's called ABCD. The word Desi means someone from India or the subcontinent. And so we're described as Australian-born confused Desi, sort of torn between two cultures, not having one foot in each place and not being legitimate. And I interviewed some young people in the up-and-coming generation like myself, and here they're quite young in cultural schools and other places. And one of this young 16-year-old came across to me and said, look, I hate being called confused. I'm not confused. There's just no one like us yet. We're the first generation that's coming up here. And you should change the name of what you're describing from ABCD to ABCD and change the C from confused to creative, because we have to invent our identity every single day and create what we want to be and create what we want to see, because no one else has seen that before. And I love that. And I think that perspective is quite unique for people to have, like a double migration, but also to see that and nurture that kind of that sense of identity that is not actually set by anyone, and we have to kind of create it, and there's no right or wrong way to do so, whereas often people perceive their own identity in a particular place, and especially if it's looked at from the outside, as kind of a monolithic thing.
And if you think about that in the context of what you're doing at Sari Collective, well, I mean, we'll talk more towards the end of this session to get more of an understanding of the media outlets that you're both running. But when you think about that from a developing story ideas or thinking about coverage topics, how does that then influence that creativity, if you like, influence or shape the sorts of things that you're thinking about?
Well, in two ways. One of our missions is to help diversify the media and get more South Asian voices in there. So we train and support writers. And so many of them come to us and say, oh, I want to talk about my identity, but I'm not sure if this is the right way to do so that'll be accepted in the media. And then we say there's no right or wrong way to be South Asian. And that's actually very liberating for them to hear. They often have never heard that before, even from within their own community. And so there's that aspect to it. And there's also the idea that, again, if there's no right or wrong way to be South Asian, then that opens up to lots of different versions of what that can look like and how people take that and transform that, whether that's creativity through the arts, whether that's applying it to, issues and challenges that we face in society. And that's also saying, well, have we accounted for the diversity within our own communities? Have people approach either Indianness or South Asianness with a sense of nuance and with a sense of specificity as to what different challenges are faced at different points from what is a very, very diverse community, and that no one person or one perspective, especially in a culture that's very deferent to its elders, there's no sort of weight put on one perspective more than the others, and often young people are disadvantaged in that way. And so we try and showcase more young voices to help showcase that different perspective that they might bring that is also valuable. And actually a lot of kind of older, later generation South Asians in Australia have come to us and said, we love seeing that younger generation articulate that intergenerational experience or their own experience, and we see ourselves in that. We also see the possibility for the future that is different than what we experienced as first generation migrants.
Thank you. Luke, do you want to chip in before we move on?
Yeah, I think I've always had a big focus on the counter story. Because like I said, there is such a homogenous view. There is these sort of static things, and so finding disruptive ways of introducing, but also, like I said, not putting that pressure on people to be a certain way, or for mob, and I'm sure this is true for a lot of other communities as well, like that sense that every time we say something, we're going to be seen as speaking on behalf of the collective. And then certainly I was thinking when you're talking about like no right way, to be, I think about that too, in terms of no right way to respond to racism. And I remember, when I was working at NITV, there was a story of this young black fella over in WA who was sitting at a cafe, and they're like two racist old white ladies sitting there saying horrible things about Aboriginal people, and he got up and he paid for their tea and then wrote on the receipt, like I can't remember the exact message, but it was, and it got a lot of media coverage. It was like, oh, what a classy way did it, and I ended up writing a sort of response to that, going like, good on this young fella, that's very good. But it's like, there's no right way to respond to racism. If you had gone up and told him, to whatever, like if he got angry, had got sad, had got like, but the idea, there was this celebration amongst white Australia of like, oh, that's how Aboriginal people should respond to racism. And it's like, and while I really appreciate the classiness of that gesture, I'm not buying every racist I meet a cup of tea. So it was that, it's interesting, like what stories are accepted, what we champion, what we want from community. And so we try to hold space to say, be what you want, do it how you want to do. But I've always had a great love of the counter story.
Thanks so much. And I'm really looking forward to digging into some of these issues in a bit more detail later on in this session. I wanted to then just have a look at, I guess, digging into some of these words that we think about when we use the word diversity. It can mean a whole range of things. So it can mean culture, it can mean religion, disability, colonialism, ageism is one I think that is increasingly being thought about by journalists, perhaps, but we also see it in the community, and then there's migration. So some of the words that perhaps represent different types of diversity. So that's my list there. How would you perhaps add to those? Sandeep, any others? Luke?
I would just say that ageism can occur at multiple levels as well. And I think there's also, and we say it to our community, that we're both an outlet for our community and also for a broader population. And that even within our community, for example, there's things that aren't called out. So there might be levels of diversity in caste, which is a religious-based construct. There's also levels of like colorism in terms of skin diversity. And there's a long history in South Asia of, promoting whiteness as just a beauty thing. So diversity can mean, I think, lots of different ideals as well that people subscribe to.
I'd take a bit more of a sort of, when you were talking before, Corin, and you said that, mainstream Australia, for lack of a better word. It's like the better word really is white Australia. There's so much of this, like when we use terms like culture, cultural diversity, multiculturalism, even ethnicity, there's a lot of imagining, I think, within that mainstream normal as synonyms for whiteness, where white people quite often imagine that everyone else is diverse, and the whole concept of diverse only means something from the perspective of diverse from something else. And so, when whiteness gets to be the invisible, unnamed norm, and one of the things I'll mention in our anti-racism training, I think particularly relevant for journalists, is if I read a story that says, 23-year-old Sydney man, I'm generally going to assume that person is white, and most audience will, because if not, it would have said a 23-year-old Aboriginal man living in Sydney. And so we name diversity from an unspoken point of diverse from what? And I think there's a huge problem within that space and that framing, and it becomes very difficult to name whiteness within that framework.
Yeah. There's also,
oh,
sorry, Sandeep, you go ahead.
I was just going to say that to add to that also brings up that acronym that I completely dislike, which is CALD, which we see a lot in our work, culturally and linguistically diverse. And yet language is this is this thing that is so diverse, and yet we're put in this box and it says, hey, well, you're an ethnic media outlet and you speak to called people in their way, and also, are you speaking their language? I mean, are you publishing in 17 different South Asian languages or not? And we come from, I guess, a culture where also English is prevalent, but not always the dominant language. And so I think linguistic diversity is another aspect that media outlets sometimes, that it gets put in a box in the same way. It's othered in the
Yeah.
same way, and yet people come in and out of having different approaches to using their own language, which is growing in Australia actually, and also using mainstream English.
Yeah, and I think that's, we have this big search for that sort of language and different acronyms and different, phrases that can help capture our diversity and our identities and our framing. But it's understanding so much of white Australia, whatever you're using, just like everyone who isn't white. And then that idea that culture, we all have a culture, and we're all influenced by multiple cultures. But the idea of whiteness not having a culture, then culture becomes this sort of minimizing, dehumanizing term, because it's like, if I have culture but white people don't have culture, then white people have reality. And then whatever, so it's like, oh, I love culture, but you still don't think it's real. You have logic, I have superstition. You have science, I have trial by error, trial and error. Like, it's this sort of framing of culture really robs it of its meaning, and then it becomes very dangerous because we put so much effort into the language we're using and what we're trying to communicate with that. But if all the audience are hearing is just every other, like every term, no matter how nuanced it is, no matter how much time we spend on it, just comes to mean other, then it falls flat.
I think one of the observations I had when I first moved to the UK was that the homogeneity of whiteness here is diverse there, if that makes sense. So there's quite a big difference in the perspectives between perhaps people who identify as being Welsh compared to people who identify as being Scottish. They both definitely don't identify as being English for a whole bunch of reasons. And I think, one of the things that perhaps when, communities move to a different part of the world, they become perhaps more homogenous because they lose that connection with, where each of them is individually from. And so that's, I suppose, again, a difference in perspective, which then I guess leads on to some of the things that we'll talk about more in this session, which is the richness of stories that come out of individuals. Sandeep, you mentioned earlier that you're perhaps the only South Asian person to have won a chili con carne bake-off, for example. And so that's something that's unique to you, that is different to, broader diaspora experiences, which then are different to broader, Australian experiences, which are different again to, US or Canadian or Australian or Indian or Bangladeshi or Pakistani or whatever experiences. And that's, I suppose, from a journalistic point of view, that's where it becomes exciting. And what I wanted to then, I guess, move on to is, if we think then about the words that we're choosing, the challenges, we've touched on these a bit, the kinds of challenges that journalists need to keep in mind when we're thinking about diversity. For example, if you're thinking about older people, not perpetuating, stereotypes or assumptions about particular groups of people in our work. Luke, you mentioned the 23-year-old man from Sydney, for example. One of the reasons why we have that picture in our minds of a certain kind of person is because we read about it or are exposed to it in the press, right? It's one of the things that shapes our perspectives. So, there's a assumption that, I was thinking about two examples. One is if you're thinking about ageism, is not to assume that older people aren't digital enough. And, if you're thinking about people, doing quality stories about people living with a disability, is that, in an interview situation, is just to constantly remind if the person has difficulties communicating that you need to speak to the person, not to their carer, about the person, for example. So those were two challenges that occurred to me. Are there other kinds of examples perhaps that both of you would like to talk to? Sandeep, go ahead.
I have a great one if you'll indulge me for about 2 minutes. it's this example. So I think one of the assumptions that people make of minorities, especially newly arrived, is that they're perhaps not media savvy, or they don't understand how the media works. And yet this is a great example. So during COVID, there was a story that came out that someone had been fined $1,600 for traveling beyond their lockdown border to get a butter chicken from a particular restaurant in Melbourne. And immediately two restaurants, one high class called Tonka and the other one called Desi Daba, which is a smaller restaurant chain, took credit for creating that butter chicken. And it turned out that this butter chicken, the person who was fined, there was a hunt for them. And both restaurants said that he came to our restaurant. And it turns out Desi Daba had found someone and told the Times of India that this was the name of the person who'd come to Desi Daba and they were after the butter chicken. Now, we did some digging in this, and this person only recently put up their own Facebook page, and it only recently had, and it never actually owned the fact that they were the person responsible until after, much later after it happened. And so it was clearly a strong PR effort on behalf of both those restaurants, including Desi Daba, to tell reporters in India who had no firsthand access to any of this about who this person was. And it wasn't actually that person, as far as we could determine, although this person was claimed as the person who was the one who was fined. And so it was just very clever work by the restaurant owners to jump on to an opportunity for public relations, and use it. And then because the Times of India published it, it came back to the Australian media, Channel 7, Channel 9, SBS, ABC, all reported on this one person who may or may not actually have been the person who received this fine. In fact, what was more interesting was that there is a Desi Daba, the person was supposedly located in Werribee, and there's a Desi Daba around the corner, so why would he travel all the way to Melbourne to get this famous butter chicken, apparently? So there's some holes in the story that were interesting, and we thought that we were the only people that are actually a little bit skeptical of what was happening, whereas the mainstream media saw it in another publication and just went with it because it was, a really great story. And equally, there was Punjabis who said, well, yeah, it's understandable that someone would travel that far and get a $1,600 fine if they really needed that butter chicken. So I think we can't assume that different minority groups aren't savvy with how the media works and how they can play in that system. And so it's worth journalists keeping their hat on and that sense of skepticism, even if they approach minorities. And I think that sometimes there's an uncomfortable tension with the majority of white journalists coming to minority communities saying, hey, I want to be inclusive, but I also want to make sure I keep my critical thinking hat on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Luke?
Yeah, I think, for everyone thinking about diversity in journalism, as particularly as it affects mob, is that, diversity of thought, diversity of experience, that idea that we're not monolithic. So when I started, because, journalists really made Twitter the place to be, but I was kind of there before that, just hanging out with a bunch of other mob, just doing whatever we would do. And then journalists would come and start, asking me for interviews or stories, and early days, like, I felt a bit special by that. I was like, oh yeah, that must mean that I'm whatever. But then the amount of interviews that would start with, what do Aboriginal people think about? And it's just like, I can't answer that. Like we think roughly 1 million different things. But then there are obvious ones as well, where it's like, that's what it says, you can't speak on behalf of all people, of any group of people, but you can, through a human right lens of like, all people want dignity, all people want respect, all people want, but that idea of asking one individual to speak on behalf of the collective is just so infinitely problematic. But then also the idea that, if you're doing an Indigenous story, any Indigenous person will do. And then, once I remember the first time I really became hypercritical of why journalists were coming to me and asking me, one was like, I think it was just simply most white journalists particularly just didn't know any Aboriginal people, and I was hyper visible through Twitter, and perceived as media friendly for a whole bunch of reasons. But it was when someone came and asked me to do an interview on Aboriginal women's experiences of living on the basics card under the intervention that I kind of went, something's grossly wrong here. Because as you may have guessed, Freddie or two, I'm not any of those things, in that, like, not a woman, not living in the Northern Territory, not on the basics card. And so I think it is really about embracing that diversity of experience, but also representing it. Like, media present a very narrow range of Indigenous thought to the rest of the country. And because it's like, I think it's like 6 out of 10 non-Indigenous people say they've never met an Aboriginal person, which wouldn't be true for any number of reasons. But that idea that, and I often say it in the training and in other spaces where it's like, there's not many things a white fella can say about white experience that I'm not loosely familiar with. There's not too much left that would greatly shock me of not being aware that that exists in some form. Whereas because we tend not to view Indigenous thought through a lens of diversity, but very oftenly through a lens of like real or fake, or thought authentic or not authentic, or we have these frameworks. So I'll say something and someone will go, oh, look, but I met an Aboriginal person once who said something different to that. And it's like, cool, okay, that's fine. But in a lot of people's frame, they're like, so which one's right? As though there's only one true Indigenous voice, one true Indigenous thought. And so, you'll see young activists, they'll go and do a protest, lead march down the street, and I'll get a phone call saying, do you want to come and talk about what they're doing? And it's like, no, go talk to them. Like, they're doing it. It's so inappropriate to just handpick other people to be spokespeople of people who are leading the actions and doing the thing. But that still so often is seen as an appropriate thing to do within Indigenous contexts.
And we're seeing some comments in the chat box as well, both sitting, I guess, on this word of assumption, the assumption that a group of people can be seen as monolithic in any way, shape, or form. The comments here, there's a diversity of interpretations. Don't assume that any particular word means the same for others. We tend to fill many words with our own meanings, and it's very important when we're writing something, for example. Just to move on, I've been thinking quite a lot myself about some of these words and what that means for practice, for my practice as, leading programs in education here at the Walkley Foundation. So if we think about the sorts of words that we've just been sharing, what would doing it better look like? And so just speaking from my own perspective, if I was to choose the word colonialism, how do I improve my ability to write respectful, accurate questions for Indigenous community members, noting, Luke, the diversity of experience and the diversity of perspectives, and needing to talk to, the people who are involved in different kinds of endeavours. As a journalist, becoming somebody whom, who's seen as sufficiently trustworthy and sufficiently accurate and representative to be contacted with story ideas. And then also to become someone who's supporting colleagues, Indigenous colleagues, to progress in the industry, for example, which is something that we do some of here at the Foundation, and there are wonderful initiatives around the country that are also doing more of that. So those are the sorts of, if we're thinking about using the issue of diversity specifically, we'll come to the solutions aspect of it in a moment. Those are some of the things that jump out at me as, I suppose, work that needs to be done around those assumptions.
One thing I would add to that list in that bigger picture piece, and sort of coming from a more traditional anti-racist lens for some of this, so some of this is like individual behaviors and representation. So we need better Indigenous representation within the industry. But when it's like, how do we support Indigenous colleagues to progress in the industry? Like, what does that mean? A lot of that is like supporting organizational change, like understanding that it's not Indigenous people who need to be brought up to this level to better fit in the industry is the reason, though we're not represented well within the industry, is a failing of Indigenous peoples. But there's actually quite a lot of changes within these industries in ways, some of which are very obvious, some of which might be more subtle, but the importance of individual behavior change sitting at the intersection of systems change. And that's like, a lot of the cultural safety framework and thinking as well. But that the first point there, like knowing how to write accurate, respectful questions for Indigenous community members, like I said, with that idea that, I'm so wary of, we have this long history of like how to work with Aboriginal people, or, like these generic things where you end up with a very essentialized list of who we are, what we like, what works. And it feels, there's something infinitely problematic about that space where it's like, you can, if you're training a puppy, then you might want to have like how to train a dash hound from opposed to How to Train a Rottweiler sort of book, but like, we aren't that. You can't talk about mob that way. So I think the real important thing that we haven't done well in media in the past is inviting that individual in. So, you know, if you want to know how to write respectful interview questions with me, then have a yarn with me and maybe a few before we go in, and actually be willing to co-design, to test out. There is a concern there about, you know, the palming off of labor, of like me doing your job to make sure you do your job well, which needs to be quite relational. Because if I don't know you and you ring up and say, Luke, I want to interview you, and can you spend several hours of your time training me to do my job well? I might not be that excited about, but ultimately it has to be that relational. It has to be tailored. It has to be, you know, so when you're thinking about for Indigenous people, you start with that basis of what is respect, what is dignity, what are human rights, and then contextualize that. So, yeah, you can go, well, being Indigenous, Luke probably thinks this or has experienced, like, that is not going to work that well that often. There are some common sense things, but really it's got to inform your thinking, make you open to possibilities, but you can't lock those in and say, because you are Aboriginal, I'm going to do this, say this, ask that. Like it just is, it isn't that kind of party.
Yeah. Sandeep, did you want to contribute to that?
Yeah, actually, I had one thought that piggybacked on what Luke was saying. I think there's two dimensions to this. There's one is the aspect of journalists working with either sources or community and speaking to them. And there's also journalists internally and the structural aspects that need to be put in place to support journalists. And I think both of those are part of diversity and doing better. One is institutional and one is externally facing. And I think the key word for me is follow-up. When we train with our writers, we say that media is a conversation. And so if you're having a conversation with someone and then, you know, you take what you say from that conversation and tell somebody else about that conversation, it becomes kind of hearsay. So there's a responsibility to be both true and honest with that, but then also tell them, hey, I told that person what you said. So oftentimes a source might be quoted from a community, and then there'll be no follow-up sending that source the piece that they were put into. So they can send that around, or they can see how they're represented, and they get an opportunity to say, well, this doesn't actually fairly represent what I've said and what the recourse is. And it's so there's an educational component about, on one hand, I said, you know, some people in our communities might be really savvy and others might not be. And it's about coming to that with an understanding that, let me check in to see where this person I'm speaking to is at. And then let me make sure I follow up with them to let them know. Equally, if we look at it internally, how is there follow-up and support when you know, minority journalists or journalists of color are going into situations where they're in white rooms all day long? Are there any opportunities for them to feel cultural safety or support in the anti-racism frameworks? There's support groups for from mainstream Anglo media presenters and, you know, executives and others to have a community where they discuss learning more about anti-racism frameworks and how to approach diversity. And then there's another support group for people of color to talk about their lived experience of being in white environments and what that does to them, or reporting on these issues and how they're supported. So I think you need to have both hand in hand, and both are just about follow-up.
Yeah. And could I just add, like, that there's, yeah, that space of, in education is where we used to do a lot of resilience training for Indigenous students. And what always frustrated with me with that framework was there was very little sort of anti-racism expectations placed on non-Indigenous staff or students or opportunities. So the idea is like, you're going to cop all this racism, be, you know, centered by whiteness and surrounded by and expected to live up to standards of. And so we're going to help you be more resilient. And so that's like, yeah, giving mob and diverse communities support to exist within these spaces and breathing space outside of them is so important. But the other side of that is like, we've got to be working on changing these institutions so that is less needed. Because yeah, that whole framing of, we're going to give you support to survive the racism we're going to put on you, but we're doing nothing to reduce the racism we're putting on you, becomes a really problematic framing. And that's again where a lot of people don't see the whiteness of these spaces, but also don't see the inherent harms of them, and assume that is a best practice space. And again, going back to education, we say, like, what is best practice in Aboriginal education more often than not is just best practice. It's just we get left out, and so much of what we consider to be best practice is very culturally loaded through that white lens. So it's understanding that mainstream best practice has traditionally meant for, and not even for all white people, for very particular groups or identities within whiteness, at the exclusive others, but that breaking down actually is better for everyone.
And I'm just checking something here in the comments that asking about holding power to account, which resonates a lot with what you're talking about, Luke. I think you know, one could also give the example of gender, for instance. You know, that you're provided with tools to weather the storm when in fact what you would like is a break in the weather. You know, just something slightly different. Let's just move on to this last question, which is, why should journalism as an industry cover diverse communities better? And we've talked, I think, quite a lot about, drawn out some of these points as to why we need to cover diversity better than we perhaps have. You know, why do we feel? I'm going to ask that just to the folks in the chat box. So this is an opportunity for the participants on the call to perhaps think about that. Why should our industry cover diverse communities better? And while you're thinking about that, let's just move on to some of the research that suggests that we could do a better job. Every couple of years, Media Diversity Australia publishes a biannual report on diversity representation in television news, for example. And what they've found is that overall, the representation on our screens is whiter than the national average, put very simply. Some outlets are improving faster than others. And it looks at the representation of people of different genders, people of Indigenous backgrounds, and people from non-Anglo-Australian backgrounds. And you know, just an open question here as to how we feel about if we don't see us on television, if we never see us. And you know, that's something I'd invite Luke and Sandeep, your views, perhaps not just ourselves, but also members of our family. What happens if our kids don't see us on TV, for instance? You know, what are some of the ramifications of that? If you have any thoughts around those questions.
Yeah, I think there's a very basic, you know, it's much harder to be it if you can't see it. You know, the expectation of being the first. But then I think there's a really much bigger conversation here when we talk about representation in media, is not just on screen. Because, you know, I mean, a great example would be like the comic book industry in the 70s, when they're like, we need more diversity in superheroes. And then you had this slew of like very stereotypical, over the top cultural representations. And so it's not just enough to have that diversity of representation, but it's got to be the type of representations. It's got to be behind the scenes as well, or else, you know, when you have predominantly white spaces being in charge of what diversity looks like. And so, you know, of course, I want my kids to see more Aboriginal characters in media, and just, you know, whether it's a newsreader or a character on a TV show or in a comic book, it's also critically important that they be good. And I don't mean good in a sense of like good guys in a story, but you know what I mean, like that the representation be real. And so there should be a diversity of, you know, if it's fiction, you know, I want Aboriginal heroes and villains and doctors and anyone and everyone in between. But I want Indigenous people involved in what the representation will look like. And then I want that representation behind the scenes as well, not just in front of.
Sandeep?
Yeah, I had 2 points to this to echo that as well. One, I think it's actually a bigger question. I think it's about what does it mean to be Australian? What does it mean to be normal? And I think there's a lot of bubbles in Australia where being Australian means just being a middle-aged white person, usually a middle-aged white man. And so I think we're having a different conversation. We have 48% of people with at least one parent born overseas now in Australia. So what does it mean to be Australian is a contested thing. And we are constantly redefining that. And so you have people of power who move from one bubble to another and sometimes never encounter diversity. Or if they go to, you know, the streets of Melbourne and it's in any proximity to anywhere, they'll see so much diversity just walking around them. And they go, this is different than what I'm used to. And I think this research actually speaks to that. So it was done in 2017 and then 2020, I believe. So it was done
2020 and 2022.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
There's a 2-year gap, a 2.5-year
Yeah.
gap.
Yeah.
And in that gap, it was COVID time. And the percentage of white executives in media organizations actually went up, and the diversity decreased by 2% in this study, from 76 to 78%. And I think that speaks to not only who's on the screen, but who's making the decisions about who's on screen. Who are the executives? Who are the board members? Who are the people in actual decision-making authority and power? If we're talking about power, power needs to be about not only like what you see on screen, but the process to get there, who's making those decisions in a room. And I think what this report keeps showing us is that there's a lack of people who, come through the ranks, both presenting on screen from different communities, and then also who then take positions of authority to help make those decisions, or if they have to advocate for their own community to be on screen a bit more, it's seen as an outlier. So SBS has now put in a policy where they're going to have a certain percentage of diversity on screen, but that's only one organization. So it comes to a question about, say, quotas. But I think for us, when our writers come to us and they say, do I have to write about South Asian issues? And I say, no, we are a place to give you the privilege that every white journalist gets, which is to write about whatever they want to write about and be seen as Australian. And so I think that's really important for us to recognize that, this is an ongoing conversation. We're still early days in Australia about defining what our media should and could look like, but it definitely needs to better reflect the population, and it definitely needs to enter into a broader discussion of what it means to be Australian. I mean, you see shows like right now, like Aisha Baden's shows that are on television, on ABC and on Netflix, that really speak to like a lead character that's, not that has a cultural background that represents us, and we get excited about that. But I think that normalizes a sense that you can be of any different background and be Australian, but the nuances and the details of those stories are really important, and only people from those communities can really capture that and understand that and share that nuance. And so seeing it from our perspective, like, we love seeing that nuance because it reflects who we are, but we also love that the nuances, the process by which that's built creates that education amongst other creators or the journalists or other executives to then carry that knowledge forward into the system. So it better reflects a broader version of what it means to be Australian.
And it's the figure of the proportion of people who have one or both parents born abroad has been, I mean, it more or less constant since I was a kid. So I remember the proportion of folks who had foreign-born parents when I was in school, which is over 30 years ago now, was in double figures, and it was high. And so the conversation around what it is to be an Australian, what it is to do journalism in Australia, is a constant conversation, I guess, here, which but perhaps hopefully in more recent years is beginning to with studies like the one on the screen, perhaps ask the more detailed, nuanced, granular questions that need to be dug into to bring about, I suppose, shifts.
I think on that,
sorry,
I'll just add to that. I think there is something that we really need to be thinking about very honestly in a very uncomfortable conversation for a lot of organizations in this space about diversity metrics and reporting. And, something like, having one or both parents born overseas, where, so you can have an organization who all the executives are white and one parent is white English and the other's white Australian, and then, ticking a cultural diversity metric in a reporting. And it's like, I'm not sure that box was meant for you. I think there's a deeper conversation about diversity and representation where, we're a very diverse workplace because, our white execs went to different white private schools. There really does need to be some interrogation of what diversity means and what it is that we're trying to aspire to. But again, this refusal to name or consider whiteness within broader discourse really does us an injustice and leaves a lot of opportunity for organizations to show statistical diversity that is still operating through this ontological whiteness and white representation lens.
I think what's exciting though is the kinds of studies that are now being done, some of the research questions that are perhaps being more actively pursued. So obviously there's the study here, the Media Diversity Australia one. There was one that was also done in 2021 at Macquarie University, which was looking at social content output and perceptions of Indigenous communities of what was appearing in social feeds, in Facebook groups, and also in news media posts to social media. This really disturbing statistic around the amount of negative content. 97% of respondents said they encountered negative content at least once a week. But also the study also looked into what sorts of content was perceived as positive, and that spoke to creative arts, Indigenous storytelling, the opportunity to connect with community, to access services and contribute to political dialogue. So I guess having the opportunity to study these things properly are the sorts of questions that are perhaps being asked now that weren't being asked 10 years ago in the research context. For the reasons of completeness, I'll just mention a couple of the recommendations from that study, which are fairly, I suppose, obvious. One is engage with more Indigenous run sources and also hire more Indigenous people. So it's not rocket science, but sometimes we need to do the study in order to reach the recommendations that inform better practice, perhaps. Sandeep, you look like you're about to say something. Nope.
I can.
Luke, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think, when it comes to like positive content and how we're framing positive content, and this link, like if anyone's familiar with sort of deficit discourse and research and conversation into that. And so, deficit discourse is this habit that we have within any numbers. It comes out of health more particularly, but it's very relevant for media. But talking about Indigenous people as though there is something inherently wrong with being Indigenous, and as though the challenges that communities face, the overrepresentation or underrepresentation, depending on what we're talking about in a given space, is somehow inherent to, the problem is being Aboriginal rather than how Aboriginal people have been and continue to be treated. And a lot of whether you're engaging in deficit discourse isn't just about how you talk about Aboriginal people, but it's actually how you talk about the world that we live in. And so there was a lot of sort of misrepresentation or misunderstanding, well-meaning or otherwise, in the early days of like, we need more positive stories and that will counter deficit discourse. And we do need more positive stories. Like a hyper focus on all the bad things is innately problematic, but we need to be honest about the challenges communities are facing. And I think this speaks very much to the idea of solutions journalism. So it's, like we still love the first Indigenous school captain. We've had hundreds of them, and every time you get one, you can get a headline somewhere if you want. And so it's like that story isn't necessarily a positive story or a deficit discourse story. It's what are you saying about the world? So do we like that story? Because look, we're less racist as a society. We're letting Indigenous people, be school captains now. Is that an individual achievement story? Is that, but also you can weaponize that story against other Aboriginal people and go, see, there is no racism. This young woman, became school captain. So obviously you could too. You just didn't work hard enough. And so the stories are the stories. The things that happen are the things that happen. But what narrative we bring to the story and how we tell it, why we're telling it, and what we're saying about the world we live in, the nature of racism, the challenges communities face. And so if you have a story like that, because people say, so what narrative should you put to that story? And it's like, whatever narrative is true to that individual's experience in the community they live in, and one day and their family are comfortable in telling. Like, this is a young person who you're going to put up and around and go, look, first Indigenous school captain of this school. There needs to be a responsibility, a dignity afforded, but we need to be very mindful of not just pumping our own narratives on top or having this problematic framing of we need to balance out positive and negative stories. Like the story is the story. But how are you telling it? Why are you telling it? And what are you saying about the nature of racism, the nature of our society, the nature of our shared reality in how you tell that story?
And that's a wonderful way of, I guess, bringing now to the fore the focus of this session on solutions journalism. So a solutions approach to that would not necessarily be looking at which school has got an Indigenous student as school captain, but more what are the conditions that create the possibility for an Indigenous person to be the school captain. What is it about that community? What is it about that school that's working that creates a situation where merit rises to the top, if you see what I mean, in any context, irrespective of who the student is. So let's just head on into a short refresher on solutions journalism. Those of you who perhaps might be joining one of these sessions for the first time. Solutions journalism is rigorous, evidence-based reporting on responses to social problems. So instead of leading with the problem, it's leading with a response to a problem, looking at what's working and what's perhaps addressing an issue and why is it working. The 4 pillars of a solutions story is that it leads with the response and how it works. It provides evidence of results, looking at effectiveness. So not just good intentions, but why is it working, and also what's perhaps not working. So including the limitations of a particular response. It has been said about solutions journalism that sometimes it perhaps should be called responses journalism. That if we call something a solution, it can imply that it's perfect solution. There's no perfect solution. There are no silver bullets, and there's always room for improvement. So a solution story should look at what are the limitations of a response, and also provide insights. So if someone wanted to try this in their context, what would they need to keep in mind? What would they need to know? So it should go beyond inspiration to providing information. Solutions journalism is one of a number of approaches to rethinking the way that we do particularly news journalism. Another is constructive journalism, developed by the Constructive Institute in Denmark. So that has sort of 3 elements of a story. Again, this focus on problems and solutions to those problems, looking at diversity of perspectives, so consulting multiple viewpoints, and seeking to create spaces for constructive discussions about the future. These approaches have been used to cover a very wide range of issues. Some of them are social problems and some of them are societal problems, if you like, so climate change or plastic pollution, but also human rights, education, healthcare, disaster management, and so on. So all of these topics here, and that's not an exhaustive list, are some of the topics that you can bring a solutions lens to. So if we think about how these issues are usually covered, I just did a basic Google search on the word housing, and then I filtered for news. I did this yesterday, and what we can often see is the if it bleeds, it leads approach to storytelling. So housing density, so home prices keep hitting fresh records. Tenants in social housing block in Victoria say they go weeks without flushing toilets. I spend more time agonising over groceries than my property purchase. High costs strangle new supply, etc. So these are problem-led stories. And if we always see news that has if it bleeds, it leads with the problem. This quote here is from the Constructive Institute. If audiences only shown what's wrong with the world, they start to feel like these issues are insurmountable. Psychologists call this learned helplessness. So if we're constantly confronted with how terrible things are, then we feel we can't really do anything about it. It's also linked to things like news avoidance, so just perhaps not engaging with the news at all. And one of the reasons that the Solutions Journalism Network's news site is called The Whole Story is that this need to also understand what can be done about it and provide audiences and communities with information that includes insights. If you wanted to try this, this is what you would know. That is the whole story. So just focusing on problems is kind of half the story. So if we think about how diverse communities are usually covered, and we've talked a lot about that in this session, and it was wonderful to have this long discussion, Luke and Sandeep, with you to kind of lay out some of the reasons why we need a shift in discourse. If we look up the phrase Human Rights Australia, quite a bit of it is sort of dull and worthy. So it's leading to government reports. And then it's also focused on perhaps things that are, around specific minority groups, but it's news about those groups rather than led by community. Luke, you've talked quite a bit about the need to engage constructively with communities about the types of, not just the types of stories that one does, but also even the questions that one would ask, for instance. So these are, and again, just very keen to hear from folks in the chat box if anyone would like to comment on any of these points. I'll just move on, I think. So when we're thinking about applying a solutions approach to diversity coverage, first things first, lead with the problem, with the response, not the problem. So one way we can do this, and Sandeep, you mentioned this, is the idea of following up, right? We can also apply this concept of a follow-up to our past problem coverage. So go back to the stories that one has done about a particular challenge or a particular problem and think, who's trying to fix this? And then go and talk to them. Just go and have a look at what's being done to address this thing. Also having a talk to the community that's impacted by a particular problem. What have they seen that's worked? And then go and interrogate that with rigor in an evidence-based way, with the same journalistic questioning of assumptions that one would make around a problem-based story. And then also to perhaps look outside of one's own context. So perhaps the community that's impacted by a problem might not have seen a solution, but perhaps someone else somewhere else in another part of Australia or another part of the world is having a go at tackling that problem and asking the question, would it work here? Could this be done in this context? Things to avoid: solutions journalism stories are not hero worship. So it's not all about the wonderful person who's tackling X, but it's about X and what's the response that's being done. That's not to say that character narrative isn't important, but it shouldn't be the central focus. It's not public relations. So it's important when you're doing a solution story to cover not just what's working, but also to ask what's not working here. What could be done better? What challenges have you encountered? What would be a next step to move this along based on the progress you've made so far? And it's not a heart warmer. It's not an and finally, it's not a puppy story that goes at the end of the news, because we do need that data and evidence to provide the insights so that folks who are consuming your content can get a sense of whether they could have a go at it themselves, and the sorts of initial questions and information they would need to do that.
Can I just say, sorry, quick, I'll
Yeah,
just one point,
please.
but that, narrative inclusion within stories, like how many people pre-write their narrative and then find a warm body to put in it is something I find just so perverse and problematic. And it's like I've had over the years, I couldn't tell you how many times. It's like, Luke, I'm looking for, say, a young Aboriginal woman, maybe she's a single mum who's doing this and doing, and it's like, you've already written the story. You've probably already got drafts of her quotes, like, and you just want a warm body to plug in like that. That is so problematic. So obviously you go in with certain expectations, or you might have a certain thing in mind, but that idea that, if you already have your narrative, you're going to make someone fit that. And particularly if it is younger people, or if it is people who are disempowered, but the moment you go in, you're the journalist. There is a power dynamic there, and you can lean that the same way that like focus group people will lead to get the outcome of a focus group they want. Like if you lead people down a narrative with the questions you ask, the framing that you have, it just really doesn't do anything to afford that dignity to that individual to have a narrative that maybe you haven't thought of, to maybe not want to be framed in that way, or for their story to be more complex than the narrative you're bringing to the table. So I will flag that, like, it's something that still happens a lot.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the reasons that we've decided to offer this kind of training is perhaps to begin to broaden the thinking. I mean, That's not to say that there isn't solutions journalism happening already in Australia. There are some excellent examples of it, and it's really to, I suppose, broaden the range of people who have a concept of doing things differently, and create pathways for that to happen. Yeah.
And I think that going back to the question that someone asked earlier about holding power to account, like if you're doing something that, there's a problem in an Indigenous community, and you see how youth crime is talked about, or whatever it might be, like if you're not looking at government funding, government programs, what they've supported, because when you're talking about Indigenous affairs, a lot of the time the government response is a huge part of the problem. So how do you unpack that and go like, what's the problem with the response? What's the problem that underpins it? How has this shifted over time? And you're not looking at issues of funding, policy approach, and talking to those people who've watched how this issue has been, because very few of these issues are new. You'll read a story about, crime in a community or child removal rates or something like it just happened. And it's like, if you're reporting about something that is a generational issue in a lot of these communities, and you're not linking that back to the history of government approaches and talking to people who can give you a generational perspective, either through lived experience or research, what on earth are you doing?
Sandeep, did you want to chip in?
I think that really covers it well, but also I think from what I've seen is that, we're talking about power to account. I had the same thought, Luke, but also I had this thought that, from a perspective of diverse communities who are often not represented in the power structures that exist in society, in the ways they need to be, it's about not only how journalists hold power to account, but also how they wield their considerable power that they already have. And what they can do with that. I think solutions journalism is an approach to say, but I think accountability rests with you to maybe look at how things are done, but how you can also be an agent of making some of these things come to life a bit more by highlighting ways that the people you're speaking to can take a path forward, what they think is right, and also what you have put together as ways, through the mess. Because I think what people are looking for is not more of the same to continue. And so telling that story about how solutions can be, how solutions can lead a response says that we've taken the time to work out the complexity of this and looked at it from the perspective of the community, looked at it from the perspective of, say, implementers or policymakers or government, and said, well, actually, the way that we can tackle this is really about how we as a journalist look at power, how we can take that power and say, if we put power into the hands of the people, this is how they would view this, and this is what they're looking for, and it pushes that perspective back up the chain, which I think is really, really important, because unless you do that, you're not affecting the system that keeps people in their minority boxes or viewed upon in certain ways, and those solutions, whether it be by government or whoever, are implemented in those same paradigms that continue to replicate the power structures that currently exist, which we know need to change.
Yeah, I think as well, and this goes back to a comment someone made about like diversity of interpretation. And so you take something like closing the gap, I think is a great example, because like we have bipartisan support for closing the gap and have done for a very long time, but there is not bipartisan support, and there's actually very little conversation about like, why does the gap exist? And so, there is so much racism about, and again, this deficit discourse plays in so heavily to this, that every year when we fail to close the gap, there's a lot of people who go, yes, because Aboriginal people need to something. We get 32 billion, we're not doing this, crime statistics, well, don't do the crime, don't do the time. There's a lot of that rhetoric where it is a built-in acceptance that we are the failure, we are the reason why the gap isn't closing. Even though, Productivity Commission will come out every report and say, government policy, you're not doing the things you say you're going to do, you're not doing them well, you're not following your own approach, you're not recognizing the change that's needed to improve. So, something, again, we talk a lot about with our understanding of a term like racism or closing the gap or whatever else, is if we have a shared language, but very little shared understanding, you can feel like you're using objective, neutral language, but then that gets filtered through the diversity of interpretation. And so, what you think a problem is really dictates what you are capable of imagining as a solution. And so I think there needs to be some interrogation of these solutions as well, and linking them back to, so what is the actual problem? You know, Tony Abbott very clearly thought Aboriginal people were the problem. So it's like, well, if your kids don't go to school, we'll punish the parents. If, you know, kids are acting up, we'll send them to jail. Like this sort of, they could very clearly saying that the problem is Aboriginal people, and therefore the solution needs to be tough on them and make them engage in the behaviors we want people to engage in. So that whilst I do like the idea of solutions and not just telling a problem, framing it as a wicked problem, I am very cautious around this idea of don't just run with the solution and go, this is great. You really need to do that critical reflection, interrogation of what do I think the problem here is? Am I open to a range of solutions? How the community talking about this? What is the evidence saying? What is the research saying? And so that, yeah, there really does need to be some careful consideration of what do you think the problem is? And that, you know, for everyone here, it's just ask yourself at the start, like, why do you think the gap exists? And if you think it's inherent to Aboriginal people and Aboriginality, rather than inherent to a denial of human rights, oppression, you know, failed government policy and a lack of accountability within government frameworks and the role of media in that, then I'd say we probably need to have a big chat before I want you running on with solutions to what you think the problem is.
And I think
yeah, 100%. Sorry, I 100% agree with that. I think that how you frame the problem is how then the audience frames the problem, and how then power structures frame the problem. So I used to be a children's lawyer, and I was representing young African boys in the children's court after, you know, African gang crisis, and there was riots. And the judge said, and I quote, "The Herald's son is rightly asking questions about violence by African gangs." And yet in the room, there were two Africans, young African boys who I was representing, and the rest were not. And so the majority of people actually involved in this were not African gang members whatsoever who'd been charged. And yet this judge is buying into a problem frame that has been set up by the media. And then that is adopted, and, you know, it was highly inappropriate, and I called it out to even mention this kind of thing, but in a courtroom, let alone anywhere else. But it just shows the power of the framing of a problem and how that can be adopted. And so I think real care is required in thinking through how you frame a problem, and real digging in. And it's probably better to look at solutions to say, you know, there are multiple opportunities to suggest how you solve this at different levels. What is the level that impacts the community most is probably the perspective a journalist can offer, whereas you know, an academic or a policy person can look at it much more broadly, most systemically. And those are good questions to ask. But I think, you know, that becomes like, you don't want to, not every piece can service everything. It's on academic essay. Yeah. So I think it's important to kind of, if you're going to choose, my view is to choose the people that you are speaking to, or hopefully speaking with, about the problem.
One of the examples of solutions journalism training that I've observed in the past is a process called dual track training that I used to deliver with Thomson Reuters Foundation in the past. What that would involve is working with a group of journalists to understand what solutions journalism is, but then also working with groups of NGOs who were working in that in a particular topic space, whether it was biodiversity or climate change or whatever, to also help those groups of folks understand what solutions journalism was, and then creating opportunities for dialogue between the reporters and people who were working with you know, NGOs and, you know, grassroots activists, community organisations and so on. And what that did was it created a different dynamic to the warm body approach, Luke, that you mentioned earlier, you know, where perhaps the reporter has a clear idea of how they think the problem should be defined, but instead created different sorts of questions to say you need to, I suppose, work with this group of people about what is the problem, what is the information that actually needs to be shared. And it also changed the way that, you know, NGOs worked with journalists to shift away from a public relations approach to a more, these are some of the things that we're doing, this is how we would frame the problem, but also here's what's, you know, not necessarily working about the work that we're doing, as well as here's what's working. So it creates a much more constructive dialogue that is much more focused on problem solving or problem addressing, let's say. I'm just keeping half an eye on the time. If you're happy for me to trundle on, I wanted to share the Solutions Journalism Network tracker, story tracker. I'll just grab a link to that and pop it in the chat box. Here we go, it goes to everyone. And what this is, it is a curated database of examples of solutions journalism from around the world. Over the past few years, it's not terribly old. It has grown from 0 to more than, I think, 16,000 stories now across a very wide range of topics from more than 90 countries. So 2 things about this. One is it's a great place to go for story ideas and inspiration around how to do solutions journalism, but also has a terrific advanced search function. And I wanted to go back to the example, if I may, of housing. So if we look at housing crisis, you can search for individual phrases like housing or housing crisis to see, earlier in this session, I was looking at how housing is often reported on, and if it bleeds, it leads. So you can find an example of how, journalists who've been looking at this issue from a solutions perspective have covered it. There's also the possibility within the Solutions Journalism Tracker let's just go back here, for issues where people face more than one kind of challenge or problem. So this is an example of a story from Denmark, where people who've arrived in Denmark who are LGBTIQ, but also from minority, represent an ethnic or cultural minority. And it was about an initiative here. I'll just share the story with you. So how locals are supporting LGBTIQ asylum seekers in Denmark. So what this is an example of intersecting inequities, where someone perhaps may experience more than one type of discrimination or more than one type of social challenge. And then the opportunity from a solutions perspective is to look for responses that are made to more than one challenge, if that makes sense. And again, you can go to the story tracker and put in multiple search functions there. So if you were thinking about story, a topic around housing and migration, for instance. So I've put in housing and migration. And there's one example. Again, the Solutions Journalism Tracker isn't decades old, it's less than a decade old, but it grows and grows every year. And so there's an example there of just the one story, but you can search for many different things in here, and it is really a terrific resource. So some of the topics and challenges, perhaps, that we've talked about a lot of them in this session. So how we cover regional or rural or remote communities might be an area for you to think about and explore as a journalist. I personally live in, it's vaguely regional, it's Wollongong, so it's striking distance to a major city, but it still is listed as a regional city. I guess one of the things that I observe when we think about regional or rural Australia, it's still sort of windmills and cows and tractors and Banjo Patterson and all the rest of it. And I think, well, that's not necessarily my lived reality. There's also the possibility of looking at economics and business stories. So what are some of the responses that are being made to specific economics challenges, specific business challenges? Health is a topic that we haven't talked about a lot in this session, but who's developing responses to access to health, for example, or healthcare challenges. Community building is another. I think we see when we talk about the topic of news avoidance, one of the things I think we observe is a lack of opportunity to connect with community, to build a sense of hope in the communities that we live in. And so to look at responses to challenges around community building. We've talked quite a bit about covering specific challenges of minorities in Australia. There's a great example of the ABC's podcast, Who's Going to Save Us? which is a quite now long-running show on climate change. So these are some of the sorts of challenges in this country and certainly, again, not an exhaustive list. So I've also put a link down the bottom there to 77 places to find solutions, stories, ideas. So I will be circulating a link to a handout of resources and guides and so on that might be useful. I've been talking for a while. Luke, Sandeep, anything you want to contribute? Please go ahead.
I have actually, I mean, we've talked a lot about our approach and the practice and the theory, I guess. I have a million practical examples of how we've done all of these things, including all of these topics that might be useful as examples to speak to for the journalists who are listening. One example is last year, we started profiling a few different South Asian tech startup founders and realizing there were stories to be told about what challenges they were tackling, including one that had created the first cell protein-based breast milk that solved a real problem for people, and many other amazing things that these people have built. And yet many of them had either never been profiled by the Australian media or were largely absolutely missing from people's minds and lists. And so we just built the list. So we built a list of 101 South Asian startup founders last year. And this is where I think solutions journalism actually can take it one step further. I think organizations or institutions can actually be part of helping solve. What we realized was that in the startup community, there's about 0.3% of investment went to women of color. There was very few lists of South Asian female startup founders. So in our 101 list, we really privileged trying to find as many female startup founders as we could. We found 24. And when we published our list, we sent it to every media outlet we could find. Not only did some of them write a story about it, but they used it in an editorial. So, for example, CEO Magazine sent a response back saying, "This is phenomenal. We plan to use this in our editorial decision making." And funnily enough, the next CEO of the year, a few months after our list was published, was a South Asian person who was on our list. So these people have incredibly high quality. That 101 people actually, the 101 founders, they've raised over $1.12 billion in investment, and they employed over 2,500 people across Australia. And so they're punching above their weight. They're doing an amazing job. And yet many of them have literally had zero mentions in the media, not been invited to speak at conferences, not been invited to be on business panels or profiled by other media outlets. And so part of the work, I think, and unfortunately we have to do it, but is collating what we know and who we know and putting that back out to be a resource or a tool that people can use. Similarly, on the health front, there was a researcher who was researching the lack of South Asians in genetic databases, and specifically in heart conditions. That is one of the major problems facing our community. So not only do we do a story about that, but we also did an online panel where this researcher was able to speak to our community. And then we held an event in Brisbane and invited her along and a few other people. There was another researcher who had just been received funding to put together a project ahead of the Brisbane Olympics. And was building a database of South Asians to talk about their involvement in sport. And we were able to link those two researchers together so they could share their lists. And now the research on heart condition, in fact, I just found out this week, has been greenlit to have 200 funded participants across all of Queensland. And to try and improve the fact there's only 2% of South Asians represented in genetic databases. And so I think we can be part of the solution, not only through the stories we tell, but the actions that we take, either to connect people that we see across the journal, the reporting that we do, or to just create a product that is useful for communities going forward, that they can reference back to and push those out into what we know is an ecosystem that needs more diversity. So many of these things are things that we focus on, and whenever we have writers write for us, we ask them, well, is there a solution to this? Is there a way that the community can then get access to useful things? And the last thing we did that I'll mention is during the COVID pandemic, many people were coming to us saying, look, we don't know where to go to get tailored help. And so we created both a list of South Asian psychologists across Australia, as well as a list of multilingual doctors that people could go to in their specific languages. Many of these doctors said, I didn't know it was an asset that I spoke Farsi or Urdu or Punjabi or Hindi. And yet, they're listed in some various places, and we just collated that for them, built a map and put it on our website so that people could find these different places to go and get assistance during the COVID pandemic. We won a City of Melbourne award for it because it was just useful for people. It was useful for people to get access to this type of information. And so if we're talking about solutions journalism as a place of data, how can you showcase that data in multiple ways? How can you insert yourself in part of the dialogue around how communities get access to better information or better insights and use those to help advance what is a gap, and things that are missing? For example, in the current family violence crisis, the people are discussing in Australia, there's a lack of data on South Asian family violence. There's no actual research studies that quantifies how many South Asians are experiencing family violence across Australia, or men's violence across Australia. And it is work that needs to be pushed forward. And there's some researchers now tackling it, but it's things that we've written about to say, well, sometimes there isn't a solution because there's a gap and there's no data, or there's not enough good data. So you need to make that kind of evident and then try and collate the conversation so that people can discuss ways forward with that. And I think every outlet can push that forward a lot more.
I think so. One of the things that you're talking about again is this, how does one frame the problem? You know, going back right to the very beginning of this session is different, different people have different perspectives, put very simply. And when you have a different perspective, you can see there's an information gap that might be completely invisible to somebody else, which then you can respond to, as a journalist. And then again, if you we've talked also quite a bit in this session around assumptions and always questioning one's assumptions, so that even if you perhaps don't share a perspective, you at least think to ask, what is it that I'm missing? What am I not seeing here that I can understand? I'm just mindful of time. I have about 7 minutes and a couple of things extra to just cover off. Some of the questions that one might ask in a solutions interview is, how are you trying to solve this problem? How does it work? What's the available evidence? We'll come to evidence just in a moment. I want to speak a little bit more about that. What's not working? What are the limitations? And what would you need to know to try this somewhere else? These are very different sorts of questions to the who, what, when, where, why that we have in news journalism. And so these are, just quite useful things to think about. And folks who've registered for this session, I'll send you a handout. It includes some much more lengthy guides to doing solutions journalism, including a couple of online courses and longer handbooks. So just regard this as a very thin edge of a nice big wedge that you'll receive as an element of doing this program. Just with regard to data, Sandeep and Luke, you both talked about this, just to draw that out a little bit more. When we're talking about diverse communities and covering diverse communities, the data might not exist at all. As you've just pointed out, Sandeep, it may not be representative. It might be limited. It may also reflect biases. Luke, you've talked about this, about the close the gap assumptions, as why does the gap even exist? And also the data might be international and not national, or it might be national but not state-based, or it might be state-based but not community-based. There's a big difference even if I think about, we're doing this session here from New South Wales, there's a big difference between, Broken Hill and Mosman, for example. And so if one was doing data on one place, it would be problematic for another. One of the things to look for is what's called disaggregated data. It's maybe a new term for some of the folks on the call. I'll put some basic explainers into what it is and how to sort of find it in the resources for this session. But more put very simply, it's data that's broken down into detailed subcategories. So, for example, being able to look at data that's about specific groups or specific genders, specific regions, people with specific access to particular kinds of things like education, etc. And that will help you more than aggregated data that's just averaged across a complete population. Where possible, it's great to have quantitative data, that's sort of hard figures, but it's not always available. And then, of course, there's qualitative data, so it's anecdotal evidence. This happened, we saw this happened to me, etc. But just noting the limitations that can arise from From qualitative data, one of them is that it's perhaps not representative of a large group of people, and also it can be influenced by one's own assumptions as a journalist, but also the assumptions of the person who's providing it. Very quickly, try to be part of the solution. I've been thinking about this quite a bit as to how we as reporters can do these things, not just do solutions journalism, but do it well. And part of that is some of the things we've talked about today, monitoring for one's own biases and assumptions. That has to do with who you choose as interviewees, the questions that you ask, the kinds of multimedia that you choose to use, who you film and photograph, and how. I do quite like the golden rule there, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So don't film and photograph or record or ask questions that you wouldn't be comfortable having recorded, photographed, or filmed or asked of you. It's very simple. And then avoid puff pieces and public relations. So solutions journalism is editorially rigorous. Maintain your editorial independence. It can be tempting if you have a particular passion about a topic or a community or an idea to want to promote that. So step back from that and think, what are the things that perhaps are not working, but also to be data focused. I'm just going to wrap up here by stopping the share. Because again, I've talked a lot, but I wanted to just throw back to dear Luke and Sandeep. Any thoughts on some of the things that I've suggested there before we wrap up?
Very mindful of time and a million things that
I know. It's always too short.
Power of language and terminology. You know, when we look back at that history, I even said that you made me think about then when you sort of domestic violence, men's violence. You know, how we name the problem really influences how people think about a solution. So you know, when government enforced move from asylum seekers to illegal immigrants all the years ago, how making sure that we don't just accept status quo language and actually are really challenging it. You know, when we have like minority or marginalized, it's like, you know, if you talk about an oppressed community or we talk about an oppression, the solution to oppression is very obvious. Stop oppressing those people. But when you talk about a marginalized, the disenfranchised, these terms that are very elusive and aloof and can mean anything. So really make sure we're accurately naming and we're using strong language around that, but we're also mindful, you know, I did want to speak very quickly just about, you know, bias as balance and holding that up against basic human rights standards. You know, like conversations, when we said in conversations about Gaza and people's inability to talk about genocide, to talk about holding, you know, two different sides of a story against human rights standards. And we saw it with the rise of the alt-right and the rise of white supremacy and everyone falling
we
over
see it with climate change
to
as well.
Platform Nazis.
Yep.
Where it's like, you know, but you don't see a child abuse advocate and researcher up against child abusers debating or not. You know, like there's a level of debate where there is no debate anymore. And
false,
so if
false
we find
equivalency
ourselves,
in both sides,
debating, do human rights exist or do these group of people deserve human rights, then that is not balance. So I think we need to be much stronger with not allowing these concepts of objectivity or whatever, because we should stop talking about objectivity in media. God, I don't have time to go. So sorry.
That's a whole other workshop.
I think you've got the thinking 100% right. So I might switch over to the practical. And for me, there's a couple of like digital tools that we have also created but advocate everyone use. So one is like how you engage with the conversation your communities are having. So if you're following a particular beat, for example, we built a kind of an RSS capture engine for all the South Asian conversations and media outlets that we could find both here and globally as part of the diaspora. And we share that with our potential, like our pool of freelance writers, so they can understand, they can look into that. And we tell them, you know, if you're following this community, you should look at what is being said by all these different outlets, both in the community and also, you know, Google alerts that come into it, newsletters that come into it, X and other social media that come into it, and all aggregated in one place. The tool we use is called Feedbin. It costs $20 for a whole year, and you can just input whatever you want into it. It gives you a particular email address, and then you can subscribe to 1 million newsletters. So if you want to create ones for the communities you're starting to follow, look at the dialogue that's going on before you start doing a story. Look at the gaps. Look, is anyone talking about this issue? Who's talking about it? And then we use link saving. So the tools we like are either Matter or Pocket. And then you can tag each one of those link saving links that you've saved with names of people. So say you come across an article of someone's, you know, a researcher in South Asian health, for example, and you can save that with that tag on it, so that when you come back to then look at your tag, you might have 3 or 4 or 5 articles, and then you can find those sources very quickly, because oftentimes, you know, unless you have a habit, you might, if you're not familiar with a particular community, and one of the things we discussed today was like, how do you go to a community maybe you don't have any access to as a journalist? So part of it is a listening exercise. What are the tools or habits that you are using to capture a little bit of information about that community? Whether it's people that are quoted, you think you can go back to. Do you have a CMS like Dex that NPR uses in the States, which has a bit more detail to it, so that you get a range of views, and that so when you go to source a story, you're not just beholden to the fact that, hey, I've only got a few hours. I'm just going to go to this community leader or head of my temple, or, you know, person who's quoted by government on a panel, and the title is misleading. Oftentimes people from our communities, sometimes they have titles and they're hungry for them, and sometimes they have 0 titles if they have a lot of knowledge. And so I think it's worth having a system in place for you, so you have access to a pool of people that you identified before you need to write a story that you might be able to go to, or you know, a set of sources that you can look through very quickly and scan through and go, wait, what's the conversation happening with this community over time about these issues? And I think those things are really important, to immerse yourself in the diversity of conversation that own community is having, or the version or the different types of that community you're having. So I think those practical tips are really important, and happy to share those tools with people if they want more information about them in a separate chat.
That would be wonderful. And please do send those through, Sandeep, and I'll include them in the handout for this session. We could talk all day, and it's you know, so much richness and usefulness from this session. I'm so tremendously grateful to our 2 wonderful guest speakers who've participated in you know, the whole of this session, in sharing nuance and insight that I think hopefully those of you who've joined the session or will watch it online will find tremendously valuable as you think about how you might use solutions journalism to cover diverse communities. This has been much, just wanted to say that your participation has made this a very rich and valuable and insightful session. So I'm most grateful to Luke Pearson, CEO and founder of Indigenous X, and Sandeep Varma, CEO and founder of Sari Collective. Thank you so much to those of you who've joined us, and the recording will be available very shortly. Thanks so much.